Welcome to this session of Discipleship and Family Ministry. In this session, we're going to talk about small group ministry with Brad House, who serves in small group ministry at Sojourn Community Church and has written the book Community on small group ministry. First thing I want to ask you is simply this. What is it that made you passionate about or to recognize the deep need for small group ministry, even to the point of writing a book about it in the church? What are some of the things, the dynamics in your life that made you passionate about small group ministry?
Sure. I think a lot of it just comes back to my story. I was a typical 80s latchkey kid. I grew up with that kind of sense of independence, autonomy, like that was kind of the highest goal. And I grew up, for the most part, outside of the church. I grew up in the Catholic Church, but not really a believer or engaged with Christ. And in college, started interacting with some ministries on campus, and actually came to Christ through a small group, a group of men and women getting together and studying the Bible. And so I think that's kind of set the seeds for interest in community, in the way that God just kind of took this independent streak in me and then redeemed that through the recognition of, like, I need community in order to live and to thrive. And then through God's comedy, I think, he brought me, called me into ministry, and with that background, called me into a ministry in which I was helping build and develop systems for community groups. And so that experience and those experiences led me to kind of write about my convictions.
Mm-hmm. A lot of times we do small group ministry just because we feel like we ought to, or because the church has done things a certain way for a long period of time, or we just think, oh, this is a way to grow the church. But I think one of the things that's helpful that you bring out in the book Community, as well as in conversations we've had, is simply the theological foundations of small groups. And what would you say, some theological truths about community, and particularly union with Christ? How do those play into our practice of small groups, or does it have anything to do with our practice of small groups?
Yeah, well, in some churches it doesn't have anything to practice in that, and that's part of the problem. One of the things I try to call churches to and pastors to is to not be drawn into the pragmatism of community. Some of the things you talked about, helping churches grow, closing the back door of the church, those are all practical outworkings of community within a church, but by no means should that be the driving force. Why do we do it? For me, that comes from theological conviction that if we look at this question of union with Christ, that without union with Christ, we wouldn't have community. Like, that's what the coming together, the tying together of the body of Christ comes through that union, and that allows us to even experience community at any level. And if we're not building community out of that union, we really are just building another version of things you can find in the world, some type of connectivity, because we feel this need to be connected, but it doesn't fulfill, because the only thing that's going to fulfill that need is the redemption of Jesus. So,
what would you say an ideal community group would look like, either at the church level, the big level, how the community groups as a whole look, or just in an individual community group? What would be the ideal for how that ought to look?
Yeah, I think that's always a difficult question, but it's always the first question is we're calling people to community. So what does that look like? How do you want it to form? How do you want it to? How do you want that experience to look like? And I generally, when I'm thinking about that, I go to two places. From a biblical standpoint, I'm thinking of, like, 1 Corinthians 12, this picture of the body, and this idea that there are no despised parts in the body, that everybody has gifts, unique gifts and talents that they bring to community, that our goal is to foster that community, to kind of look at it like a garden, and we're tending that garden to see all of those gifts flourish. But from a practical standpoint, if I was to say, what is the image that I want leaders to have, I think of Thanksgiving. I think of Thanksgiving dinner as a family, because if we go back to that idea of union with Christ, we are made one family. And I know for you have an adopted family. You have children that are biological and children that are adopted. But for you don't see them as two different sets of children. You have one unified family. And that's what Jesus does for us in community, is that I think we have a hard time seeing that reality, that as brothers and sisters from the church come and gather in my home, that we truly are family. We don't designate, well, this is my real son and this is my adopted daughter. We should see ourselves as family. And so I like to give that vision of Thanksgiving dinner, not necessarily how it actually is, but maybe how we wish it was, right? Some of us have that beautiful Martha Stewart type Thanksgiving dinner, and some of us, our family histories are different. But if you imagine what Thanksgiving dinner should look like, which is we come together, enjoy one another. We have a meal, but during that meal, we have the opportunity for deep conversation. And sometimes that conversation goes deep and is a soul-bearing, soul-searching conversation. And sometimes we're just talking about the Lions and why are they on football every Thanksgiving, right? And so what I see as kind of the ideal community group or small group is one where we come together with that sense of family, where there's opportunity for both depth, studying the Bible, prayer, caring for one another, and also joy, that we can eat meals together, that we can enjoy the ups and downs of life, but we do that with great joy and fun.
I think that Thanksgiving analogy actually works also for the messy parts of community group, because the fact is, I think most of us have in our community group at least one person that's that awkward uncle that always shows up, and he's part of the family, but he makes everybody feel a little uncomfortable at that point. And real community group also does that as well. It's just like Thanksgiving dinner. And
exactly. We never have that argument within our family. Do we invite crazy Uncle Bob? He gets to come, and there's actually a normalcy to that, and that's what I love about community. When we hit kind of the mark, I believe in what God has called us to, is that we're able to do that, accept everyone in, right? That picture of no despised parts. That even those parts that we need to be more modest, like maybe we don't want to show Uncle Bob off, that we have a little bit more tender care with them within community.
Right. What would you say is the relationship between discipleship and community? The focus of this class is really on discipleship, but how does that connect with small groups and community, this idea of discipleship? And I ask that because a lot of times in our particular culture, we view discipleship as something we can pretty much do on our own. Like I could be a disciple by myself by studying the Bible, getting everything right theologically. And I think what we recognize is that's not enough, but kind of flesh out the specifics of discipleship, community. How do those work together?
I would argue pretty strongly that I don't know that you can do discipleship in isolation. I think we know kind of the foundation for community. Pretty common understanding is that we're created in the image of a God who exists in relationship, and so this Trinitarian picture of God who creates us in that image becomes that foundation of how we relate to one another, how we relate in the world. And a lot of times the mistake that I see is that we settle for just that answer. Hey, well, God exists in community, so you should too. And we miss the heart of God, that God's desire for creating us in His image is an act of love, that we would experience the love that He experiences in the Godhead, the unity of purpose, the harmony of purpose within the Godhead, and that's an act of love, that His pinnacle of creation would be able to experience that. And so when we see, essentially Genesis 3, the fall, and then we go to this idea of, well, we should all exist in community just like God. We forget that Genesis 3 exists, and there's a reason why we can't. There's a reason why there's tension between you and I as human beings, as well as a tension between me and the creator of the universe. And what we see in Ephesians 4, which is really cool, is that Paul makes this argument for unity within the body, to be eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit. And he appeals first to the Trinitarian nature of God, and then he appeals to the work of Jesus Christ, that he descended, and through his life, death, and resurrection, he made it possible, giving us the ability to actually experience community. And so he gives us this for me, the theological argument that we have a foundation in the Trinity, and that Christ makes it possible, and that's what drives us to be able to grow and become more like Him. And that's the goal of Ephesians 4, right? He's saying, he's saying that as a group, not as individuals, but as a community, that we would grow to maturity, to the fullness of Jesus Christ. And that's not something that he's talking to individuals. He's talking to us as a community of believers.
Right, and in the book of Ephesians, it's important that he's talking not merely to a group of believers, but to a group of believers that are divided at a very basic level. It's Jew and Gentile in that community. And we know from chapter 2 that in that community, there's true tension. There's tension going on between them, and yet it's solved in community in the foundation of the Trinity by means of the work of Christ. And that's so important in the book of Ephesians. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.